Hello, and welcome to Giving Ventures, a show to help you grow your giving and change the world for the better. Our conversations with social entrepreneurs and generous philanthropists highlight innovative charitable efforts and smart ways to have more impact with your giving. I'm your host, Peter Lipset, Vice President at DonorsTrust. This show is a production of DonorsTrust, the oldest and largest donor-advised fund focused on serving conservative and libertarian donors of all capacities to simplify, protect, and grow their giving. My colleagues and I talk with a lot of groups doing great work. With Giving Ventures, we can share a bit of what we learn with you. Well, if there is one thing that we can all agree on about the new tax bill, which is known as the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, it is definitely big. Taxpayers everywhere probably are going to celebrate the fact that it lowered the tax levels or kept the low tax levels from 2017. At DonorsTrust, our attention has really been on the charitable changes that have come out of it. And if you are curious about those, you can always reach out to us and we can talk about those because they do change the dynamics just a little bit. But our guest today surprised me in a conversation recently because he shared that there are some mandates, some clauses in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that are going to enable pro-market, pro-liberty things to happen in blue states. And that is a pretty unique and exciting thing. So what is this alchemy that we can expect? Tarren Bragdon is here to share more with us. Tarren is the founder and CEO of Foundation for Government Accountability, which is based in Florida, but works across the country to promote and to win on policies related to welfare, unemployment, workforce, election integrity, healthcare, all of these often kind of unsexy or under the radar issues where they are having an outsized impact and making really great gains. It was only founded in 2011, but in that time has really become one of the outstanding examples of what think tanks can do for pro-liberty causes. So today we're going to explore how these pro-market ideas can be expanded in blue states thanks to this bill. We're going to look at topics around work requirements and government aid, and whether there's going to be some real changes in healthcare. So let's get started. Tarren, great to see you.
Peter, great to see you as well. Thanks for the opportunity to be on the podcast.
So, I mentioned you guys work on this whole plethora of issues, and frankly, it's not necessarily just the straight taxes, or it's not the kind of standard slate of think tank bill or items. You work on all kinds of really unique things, really hard things, and you do it in this way that really brings out the compassion of it, the kind of compassionate conservatism, if you want to use that phrase still. Let's start with the safety net, because this is something that you guys work on a lot. It's going to build all into this question about what is the Beautiful Bill Act going to actually enable. But the safety net is this very complicated thing. And by here we're talking about SNAP benefits. We're talking about just all of those types of things that often Republicans like to rail against to a certain extent. They're really hard to reform. I heard you recently share a story from your time as a legislator in Maine about why the safety net is so hard to reform. Can you start with telling us that?
Sure. Well, we're all impacted by early experiences in our life. And one of my first experiences of my professional life was this opportunity to run for the Maine legislature in my hometown of Bangor, Maine. And this was back in 1996. And my district had the largest section of public housing north of Boston. And so literally, as I would campaign door to door through this public housing development, I got to see up close and personal just the impact of government dependency, the hopelessness of individuals who are, receiving benefits, but really being trapped in poverty. And this interesting thing happened between my primary and the general election. Bill Clinton signed the bipartisan welfare reform bill that August. And when I went into the legislature in Maine, I was assigned to the Health and Human Services Committee and got to work on welfare reform. And this is powerful because some of those same constituents that I met campaigning early on in 1996, I got to see the impact of what happened with welfare reform. And one woman in particular stands out to me. Teresa was somebody I met that summer of 96 in the public housing development, literally on her doorstep, and saw that she was impacted by these government handouts and really kind of bleak about her future and a bit hopeless about what it meant. And then at the same time, I got to see the impact as she went back to work and was able to experience the joy of earned success and creating a life for her two daughters that she always wanted as a child. And just like what happens with free markets and opportunity, it's not just about that first job, but how you build from it. Teresa later went on and became an owner in a marketing company that still operates in Bangor now almost 30 years later. And so I got to experience that as a lawmaker very early on, and it made me really passionate about helping people in poverty. And the best way to help somebody in poverty is through the miracle of work. And the best public policy to do that, as we saw way back in 1996 with welfare cash assistance, is work requirements.
Yeah, and the dignity that comes from work is so important, and it's really become a big piece of the messaging on the conservative side, trying to make that case. Do you feel that and we'll come back to work requirements, but like, do you feel that dignity piece is actually getting through? Like, is the conservative kind of free market message around that making any headway? Or I feel like we're still being smacked down of we're heartless and we don't care, and that's why we want work requirements. But do you feel like we're making any headway there?
I do. And I think that, messaging matters as well as public policy matters. And just shifting to, as you mentioned, the whole dignity of work and leaning into that rather than focusing on, you might remember some of the rhetoric from the early 90s was really focused on, language like welfare queens or being a little more demeaning towards single parents. Now I think we recognize it's not about sort of focusing on the individuals who are trapped in poverty due to bad public policy, but focusing on how do we let them get started on the first step to the American dream, and that first step is a job.
Yeah. So work requirements are one of the things that were put into this One Big Beautiful Bill Act. I think not in small part to some of the work that FGA did, and certainly some of your alumni. What is the requirement now going forward, and is that everything you were hoping for?
So this is really exciting news. It is the biggest welfare reform bill ever passed in Washington, D.C. I had an opportunity during this whole One Big Beautiful Bill work to interact with Newt Gingrich, and he described it the exact same way, which matters because he was the one who led the whole effort way back in 1996 with then President Bill Clinton to get the first Welfare Reform Act. And what the One Big Beautiful Bill does is it, for the first time, enacts welfare work requirements for all adults who have no disabilities and no kids on food stamps, and for all adults with kids who are 14 and older on food stamps and Medicaid. So Medicaid and food stamps have a mandatory work requirement that covers all adults with no kids or disabilities and all parents with kids 14 or older. It's a massive transformation in these two really big government programs. And what most people don't realize, we're recording this video in November, the food stamp work requirement actually went into effect this month. And then the Medicaid work requirement begins just a little over a year from now. So these are not things that will happen in the distant future. These are things that are beginning to transform lives and the economy right now.
Well, and one thing, so that same philanthropy roundtable meeting where I heard you tell that story from your time as a legislator, you also shared some statistics about just who is that safety net helping these days, or has it been helping? What is the nature of the quote unquote welfare queens these days? It's not the quote unquote welfare queens, is it?
No, not at all. In fact, the average recipient on welfare, Medicaid welfare or food stamp welfare, actually looks like you and I, which is very, very different than what it was back in the 1990s. Back in the 1990s, when you had welfare cash assistance, we had about 4 million people receiving welfare cash benefits every month. Over 90% of them were single parents. Less than 10% of them were men. And it was this really small population. And those work requirements were transformative. Within 3 years, welfare enrollment dropped by more than 60%. In red states that really enforce this work requirement, their welfare cash assistance rolls are down 95% from where they were almost 30 years ago, just in raw numbers. So they are incredibly effective with moving people from welfare to work. But today, if you look at like Medicaid work requirements, Medicaid work requirements, rather than 4 million people, you have 21 million able-bodied adults on Medicaid expansion under Obamacare. If you look at this population, almost 90% of them are childless adults. So rather than 90% being single parents with kids, 90% are adults with no kids. More than half of them are men, and more than 60% self-report that they're not working at all. And so the welfare of today looks nothing like the welfare of 30 years ago. And I think what that means is there's even more of an opportunity to transform people's lives and move them from welfare to work. And we know that with work requirements, people don't just go back to work. They go to work in 1,000 different industries. Their incomes triple over the next 2 years. So if they were working part-time, then they're going to full-time work. And they move up and move into more profitable industries. So it's not just welfare to Walmart or welfare to McDonald's. They actually move into a variety of jobs and then move up, just like we all did.
Yeah. So, and you said 60% are not working, but I presume most of those are also not looking for work?
Correct.
Well, that's just... So those are the people that now have to go get a job if they want to retain some form of benefit.
Correct. So
with the goal,
again,
ideally, of getting them off benefits.
Right. So back in the 1990s, 90% single moms. Today, with Medicaid expansion, 8% are single moms. Wow. So it looks completely different from what it did 30 years ago. And a lot of folks don't realize that. So a big part of what we do is just educate. But if you think about it, helping those individuals who have no kids and no disabilities go back to work is a lot easier than dealing with all the challenges that a single parent might have, like with childcare or other transportation limitations. So I think we can expect an even bigger transformation economically from these work requirements.
And so work requirements is a great step that's in that bill. What are the next pieces of what I think I've heard you call the accountability agenda? Like how do you continue to phase out some of those welfare, not in a way of pulling the rug out from under people, which is what the left likes to accuse people like you and me of doing, but of actually helping them to get to that dignity, get to a life where they don't need the government, and you can actually reduce those roles.
Well, another big piece, and these were also changes in the One Big Beautiful Bill, is a lot of anti-fraud measures focused on ensuring if we have limited taxpayer resources in Medicaid or in food stamps, we want to make sure that those go to people who are truly needy, like the elderly, the disabled, kids in poor households. And we want to make sure that there's not a lot of fraud there. Brooke Rollins, who comes from the think tank world as well, but now is the Secretary of the Department of Agriculture, which oversees food stamps, she just recently put out a report where you have hundreds of thousands of individuals who are either enrolled in multiple states for food stamps, or they're inaccurately enrolled, fraudulently enrolled in food stamps because they don't qualify, whether they're here legally and don't, or here illegally, I should say, don't qualify, or they don't meet other qualification criteria. And so there's a lot of work to be done as these programs have grown dramatically. There's a lot of fraud and waste, and the One Big Beautiful Bill goes after that and also holds states accountable. So if states don't clean up their Medicaid and food stamp rolls because they control eligibility, then they're going to be on the hook for billions of dollars. So it's not just a policy change, it's also a stick from the federal government saying you have to act on behalf of the taxpayer as well as the welfare recipient and make sure that the people who need it have it, but the people who are on the program inappropriately shouldn't be burdening the taxpayer.
Do we know how much of that fraud is just like people not unregistering and then forgetting to register, and maybe their checks are going but they're not actually getting to the person, but it still shows that they're going out, maybe somebody else is cashing them, versus like actual people saying, oh, I'm in Wisconsin but I can go across the border into Illinois and get on that roll too? And how much actual malfeasance is there versus just blundering? Sure.
Well, we don't really know that. I think what we do know is that the vast majority of fraud is on not the provider side, so not on the Medicaid provider side or not on the food stamp retailer side, but on just the person receiving benefits or receiving an amount of benefits that they're not entitled to. And that could be the caseworker processing it on the front end was sloppy, or it could be somebody deliberately misrepresented themselves. In reality, it doesn't really matter because you and I as a taxpayer are on the hook for it. And so what we need to do is just have a system that has integrity, both for the individual, so somebody who needs it is getting it, but also for the taxpayer, for if somebody doesn't need it, that they're not receiving it or they're not entitled to it.
Yeah, just clear, transparent rules that everyone's following, clear, transparent methods of cleaning up the rolls, all of that, which I imagine vary state to state to a certain degree.
Very much so. But you also had a bunch of changes in the Biden administration that made it a lot easier for people to get on the program, to stay on the program, and a lot more lax oversight and changes in federal rules that said states couldn't check and enforce eligibility rules as much as they could before. So you had dynamics like, say, on the food stamp retailer side, where they made it a lot easier to become a food stamp retailer. You might see an EBT sign in the window. So literally there are 5,000 EBT retailers that have liquor or tobacco in their business name. So like Joe's Smoke Shop or Joe's Liquor Store. That wasn't the case 5 and 6 years ago. And so you had a lot more, there's a lot more opportunities for fraud as these rules have become more lax. And that big change in the One Big Beautiful Bill, I think just means you'll have a lot more program integrity and you won't see this explosion like we saw with food stamps where back in 2019, it was under 20 million people on the program. Now it's over 40.
Well, okay. Well, I teased at the beginning this promise you made to me that the One Big Beautiful Bill Act opens all these doors to actually bringing some pro-market reforms into blue states, which, is not always an easy thing to do, as you know, having been from Maine, which kind of oscillates all over the place. Talk to us about these. I imagine some of what you've talked about already kind of gets at it, but tell us this narrative. How can we actually leverage the rules, mandates, changes in this bill to move the needle for liberty in blue states?
So this is a really exciting thing because as an organization, FGA got started working in red states because these are the states that would be most apt to pass the free market reforms, whether it was in healthcare, welfare, education that we worked on, or regulatory reform. But what came out of the One Big Beautiful Bill is not a bunch of opportunities for states to apply for waivers or to consider, new federal levers. But instead, there was this free market mandate that all 50 states have to obey. And there's this fiscal consequence if the states don't obey the federal law. And so what that means is whether you're in Florida, where I live, or in California, you have the same work requirement. And you're going to have a federal government that's really focused on enforcement. And so as, conservatives in blue states, I think a lot of times you feel like you're the loyal opposition. Maybe you can talk loudly, but that's all. Now, as a conservative lawmaker in those states, you're almost in the majority because you now have this federal law behind you, and you can work to ensure enforcement of that law. And if it's not enforced, then the state's going to lose really significant federal money. And I think that we're going to see, just like we saw in the 1990s, even in blue states, we had welfare enrollment drop by almost 70%. And so blue states can be held accountable and blue states can be transformed by this policy change in the One Big Beautiful Bill. And that's really exciting.
Well, and that's got to obviously FGA is a leader in this. You're doing a lot of work, but it's also going to take a kind of full frontal approach, right? It's going to take the state think tanks. It's going to take litigation groups. Totally. I imagine this is going to be a movement-wide effort to a certain extent.
I think very much so. And for us, we're expanding. We have this whole Blue State Accountability Project because we want to empower and work with those conservative lawmakers to hold their feet to the fire, but also interact with our federal partners in the Trump administration to ensure enforcement. And so it's an exciting opportunity to have an even bigger footprint. And for those of us who have been in the policy world forever, you dream of a 50-state impact, but it doesn't come along very often. And this One Big Beautiful Bill had that, and it's really exciting.
So give us a for instance. So pick your favorite blue state, California, New York, New Jersey, wherever you want to do.
Sure.
What's a for instance of what this plan of attack looks like? What do we expect them to fail on, and how do you push back?
So let me just give you a little scope of what we're talking about. So just to put it in perspective, control of the U.S. House was decided by 7,000 votes. So, Mike Johnson being Speaker was decided by 7,000 votes. The number of people who are impacted by work requirements in just these blue states alone is over 11 million. And we expect that nearly 8 million of them will move from welfare to work and off the welfare rolls completely. And so you have this massive impact in those blue states. And so what we're doing is then getting reporting from those states. What conservative lawmakers can do is hearings and oversight activity, actually ask the state bureaucrats how they're implementing that bill. We can coordinate with folks in the Trump administration to be sure they're being held accountable for that with their own reporting. And if they don't obey the federal law, then they're on the hook for hundreds of millions and billions of dollars in additional costs to their Medicaid and food stamp programs. So it's not a carrot, it's several sticks. One of those sticks can be employed by the Republican lawmaker and policy organizations working in that state, but you also have the full force of the federal government behind you enforcing this law. And as we talked about earlier, this isn't something in the future. The food stamp work requirement began this month. The Medicaid one begins in about a year. And so these are things that will happen very rapidly and happen under the Trump administration too, which will just ensure seamless enforcement regardless of what happens next year in the elections.
And I mean, we're recording on November 19th, so it's probably too early to have seen any impact of that food stamp change. Is there any indication that it's actually working, or when would we know that either we're seeing the states comply, we're seeing the states do it, or not, and more pressure is going to be needed?
I think very soon, because states report to the federal government on a monthly basis. So some of this was interrupted by the shutdown, but we'll start seeing very quickly, and certainly as we're going into 2026 and state legislative sessions start, we'll start seeing the impact of that federal law. But here's what we know back from 1996. Even the conversation about a work requirement changes individual behavior. So if I'm receiving food stamps or I'm on Medicaid and I know I'm going to be subject for a work requirement, I start moving and getting the training or applying for a job now before the work requirement goes into effect. It's sort of like if I'm unemployed and I know my unemployment benefits are running out in a few weeks, I get more aggressive about finding a job. And it's going to be the exact same thing. So we're already seeing some of that movement just based on the law was signed on July 4th. People are getting educated about it, and now it's beginning to go into effect.
Well, so how you say you've been working? I mean, I know FGA has been working in a number of states for a long time. This is obviously a massive scale up. How do you do that? How do you employ partnerships with other organizations? Because we don't want to just put all the emphasis on one state failing. Sure. Other states are going to fail too. We want to stop all the failures. So how do you do that?
Well, for us, we are active in about 30 states right now. So this is going from 30 to 50 states. So that's a big expansion. But we have the infrastructure with coordinating with state level think tanks in those states, because many of them have relationships and connections in blue states already. They're a trusted resource. And so there's an opportunity to partner with them. Also through our C4, we might work with lobbyists on the ground who have connections with lawmakers, and so we can help with education and briefings. But we've already been reaching out and in-state in those blue states with briefings so they know here's what implementation challenges you have, and then providing resources to them, whether that's legal support, policy support, or just understanding. Separately, the White House has a whole endeavor where they're bringing state lawmakers to the White House for briefings on the One Big Beautiful Bill from the administration. And so you have this joint effort of the Trump administration briefing state level lawmakers like we never saw before, and then policy groups like ours also working directly with them.
And I imagine the C4 piece will be an expanded component. I mean, I because let's say California just doesn't do it. that's an opportunity to remind people why their work benefits come
Right.
or why, costs are going up or whatever it is, and make sure that blame gets put where it should go.
You're absolutely right. And one of the interesting things, we just did a state level poll in California looking at how do voters feel about these welfare work requirements and other big policy changes in the One Big Beautiful Bill. And they have majority support. And so in sometimes 60, 70% of voters supporting them, even in a deep blue state like California. And so you also have, these aren't just good policy, they're good politics. And exactly what you're saying, if the state doesn't follow through, it really provides an opportunity to contrast sort of this conservative worldview from a very statist, welfare state worldview that the left is pushing.
Yeah. What do you anticipate is the biggest challenge here? Nothing ever goes as smoothly as we planned, right? We're not just going to charge the hill on 50 states and have it all work. I mean, that One Big Beautiful Bill Act there's things in it people don't even know are in there yet. Where do you anticipate right now facing pushback, facing challenge to being successful here?
I think the challenge really is vigilance and not getting distracted by the next shiny object. And so a big part of this is just the follow through at ground level in these states, but also with the federal government of ensuring compliance, because we're marching forward under a really tight time frame. But like anything, whether it's in business or in your personal life, sort of discipline and consistency matters a lot. And I think that's the challenge to us as a policy group and all the policy groups of we need to be vigilant over a period of time. We didn't get this big policy win by starting on it yesterday. We started on it over a decade ago, and we need that same kind of long-term focus ensuring the implementation, because it's literally life-changing. Right? And just like I talked to you about Teresa, like I saw that transformation of the miracle of work. We have an opportunity to do that with more than 10 million Americans, and these are our neighbors.
Well, this is an important point, a point I make a lot, that this is a long-term game. I mean, the donors listening to this podcast are most likely understanding of that. They've been investing in think tanks and such for a long time, but there's certainly a lot of donors out there who think more on a political mindset, and you can make changes overnight. And even when they come overnight in something like the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, you still have a long game afterwards, and you have to be investing. And it's fun to work with donors who understand that long game, that those overnight successes really take years in the making, and it's a point worth reinforcing. Okay,
well,
I want to... Oh, go ahead.
No, just to that point, I think that there's nobody who understands that better than an entrepreneur like your donors, because a lot of times people look at a really successful business and they think it's an overnight success story, when really it's a decade or 2-decade overnight success story. And it's the same is true in the policy world.
Yep, 100%. All right, I want to pivot to healthcare, which is another place that you've done a lot of work. This is not a breaking news podcast, but as we record this, again, mid-November, suddenly healthcare really is in focus in a way that it hasn't been in a while, and almost in a positive way for kind of conservative side of things, as the president seems to actually be wanting to move the ball forward on some pro-market reforms. The shutdown had healthcare at the center of it because it was these Medicaid requirements that were really the point of tension. Are we actually going to get a real healthcare debate? And more importantly, is it going to be more than just words? And are we actually going to see kind of a conservative healthcare counter to Obamacare?
I think absolutely. It is exciting to see that the right is embracing healthcare as an issue that they can lean in to and create positive changes in patients' lives rather than an issue that they need to run away from. When you had the failure of repeal and replace back in 2017, a lot of people got gun shy about the issue overall. And you're right. One of the fascinating things about the shutdown, particularly for the Senate, which stayed in session during the entire 40 plus days of the shutdown, is they had weekly presentations every Wednesday educating all the Republican senators on healthcare. I had an opportunity, as well as a bunch of other public policy folks, to present at those Wednesday luncheons. They're called the Senate Steering Lunch, and educate members about this issue. And so they're more educated about the problems of Obamacare than they ever were, but they're more motivated to fix it And I think that there's a lot of positive reforms. And one of the big shifts, Peter, is I think people are moving away from we need to tear down Obamacare to we need to build a more functioning free market system alongside it. So an analogy would be if you think back to the early days of school choice, it was less about here's how we need to reform the public schools. And it's more about here's how we create opportunities with charter schools or with school scholarships for certain types of students, and we build a better system alongside it. Republicans are shifting to that kind of approach with healthcare, and Americans ultimately will vote with their feet. The Affordable Care Act is anything but affordable, and so if you build a parallel system that's more patient-centered, more flexible and free market focused, you're going to have businesses and individuals migrate to it. And the exciting thing is, it's not just about healthcare. The president has talked about really an affordability agenda because a lot of voters under 40 in particular are feeling like the American dream is slipping away. It's becoming unaffordable. And there are two things in that are really key. One is healthcare, and then one is housing. And the White House is really interested and focused on how do we create affordability in those two areas, particularly for folks under 40.
Yeah, I mean, the repeal and replace fight was great, except that we had nothing to replace it with.
Right.
And so if we can actually solve that problem, then you actually get something. And that's a really interesting point you make about shifting the mind frame of just building a parallel system almost and create competition. I feel like another piece of that, maybe you're working on this, is the messaging side to say that quote unquote capitalist healthcare system we have is not capitalist at all. And here's why, and this is what you need to understand. And also, you can opt out of it and go to this other system. Is that messaging happening?
Very much so. And that we're doing a bunch of polling and messaging work to really look at what's the best way to talk about this. But how you just talked about it is a key lesson learned. At a high level, Americans like more choices, but we don't want any taken away. And so that's not just a good strategy from a public policy perspective to add additional choices, but it's also a really good strategy from a messaging standpoint. So that, and even if you hearken back to the Obamacare debate, even President Obama back then talked about, like, if you like your plan, you can keep it. If you like your doctor, you can keep it. Now, that turned out to be the PolitiFact lie of the year, but even the left was leaning into then, we're going to give you new things in addition and take nothing away. Now the right is embracing that same message and policy mindset.
Well, it seems that, I mean, we often say that the original sin of healthcare was linking it to work, right? Which I tend to agree with. But I think the original sin of Obamacare was making it about health insurance versus health care. And we have allowed, we speaking broadly as kind of the conservative side, I think allowed that fiction to continue. We keep talking about insurance. To me, the pivot has to be in somehow changing people's mindset that we need to stop talking about insurance and, like, do you want to be healthy? Do you want to live long? Do you want to live those 10 extra years? Because just because you're insured doesn't mean you get to live those 10 extra years. You actually have to take care of yourself.
Right. It turns out a plastic card in your wallet isn't magic and makes you suddenly healthy. You're right. There's a bunch of other choices. Certainly, you need access to health care, particularly when life throws you a health curveball. But it's also a bunch of personal responsibility, just like it is in every other part of a free market system.
Yeah, it's that personal responsibility piece that seems to be the breakdown for a lot of people. So
I think so, but it's interesting because even some of the conversation around the Make America Healthy Again, RFK, I think has shifted the conversation more towards health and less about health insurance, like you were just talking about. So whether you agree with all those different components or not, we've seen this complete shift of much more of a focus on what is the outcome, what is the health of the individual, and less about what's the price of the plastic card, which may or may not be helpful to improving your health.
You give me a little enthusiasm. I don't know. I'll believe it when I see it on the healthcare stuff. But man, that's a big issue to try to win. All right. Well, as we wrap up here, next year's a big year going into midterms. This is not a political show, but politics drives the conversation a lot, and all kinds of skeletons are going to come up in the next year. What are the big issues, maybe the underreported issues that we should be watching over the course of the next year that actually can move us in a more pro-market, pro-liberty direction?
I think this whole focus on affordability and housing and healthcare is really key. And I think that this will be an issue that resonates with voters, but also is really core to the DNA of everyone listening to this program. Part of the American dream is the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that pursuit of happiness is sort of ownership of my own home, being able to be in good health so I can enjoy the life I've worked hard to create for myself. So I think we're going to see more of an emphasis and focus on that affordability piece, but an affordability with those two components, which will be really fascinating and is a different way to be relevant to voters. And I think you'll see both at the state level and the federal level a lot more conversation about that.
Yeah, and it's a big issue, and it's not an issue that the conservative side has always necessarily been able to articulate well. And so if you can shift that paradigm and kind of take that issue from the progressive left, then that's a big deal.
No, I think you're right. Like, housing is another great issue. This is an issue where the left has leaned in heavily to it. There's a lot of government money into it. But if you look at people who own single-family homes, they overwhelmingly vote to the right. They lean to the right. And so by not engaging in how do we make single-family homes more affordable, then you're missing out on being relevant to a core part of the conservative base. But we also know other things. Like, I just saw this study that looked at fertility rates based on single-family homes in that county. And counties that had fewer single-family homes had lower fertility rates than counties that had more single-family homes, because it turns out it's hard to raise a family in an apartment. And so there's all these, when you look at a bunch of cultural issues, there are all these overlaps to that affordability issue for other things that we care about, but it's probably harder to move the needle from a public policy perspective.
Yeah. It's going to be an interesting year. This is exciting, though. I mean, just to be able to expand into a 50-state strategy, not just FGA, but all of these groups, right? To actually have something positive to put forth, because a positive agenda is frankly what America needs a little bit more now than just all the yelling and the screaming. So I appreciate you raising this issue to me, helping me understand it, helping all of our audience understand all of these weird, complicated issues, and really appreciate the work that FGA does. It's great.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about it.
So, big opportunities on a lot of fronts. I love talking to Tarren because he is always very enthusiastic about the things that are possible, and he always knows lots of things that are possible. And it was really interesting to hear how this one big, beautiful bill act that has so much in it, 800, 900, 1,000 bajillion pages, has some real opportunities that can advance pro-liberty, pro-market ideas in a really good and positive way, and open the door for people to really kind of take back ownership of their own decisions. And I think that is at the core of what a lot of us should be promoting. I also liked hearing that, obviously Foundation for Government Accountability is going to be very involved in this, but your local state think tank or other groups are probably going to have an opportunity to engage with some of this work as well. And so there's a plethora of places to invest your charitable dollars to move the needle here, which is great. Well, I appreciate you joining us on this journey today. As always, if we at DonorsTrust can be helpful to you, then that is what we are here to do. This is the time of year, especially as we record this into the year, people are thinking about charitable giving. People are often thinking about, they wish they could do it in an easier way. And that is what DonorsTrust is built to do, is to help you do that giving in an easier way, whether that's easy from a simplification standpoint, a tax efficiency standpoint, or just knowing that you're working with somebody who actually shares your values, which is no small thing in this world today. So reach out to us, DonorsTrust.org. You can reach out to us there. You can email me at tellmemore@DonorsTrust.org. Would love to hear from you. Would love to have a conversation with you about anything, or about feedback on this podcast and how we can be helpful to you. Well, we will be back in a couple weeks with another episode, another great discussion. Until then, thank you for being a giver. We'll talk more soon.